Hi, I'm Georgia, and this is Campbell's Biology, Chapter 11, Cell Communication. So there are three main ways that cells can communicate. First, they can communicate by direct contact, which means they're right next to each other. So this occurs both in gap junctions between animal cells, which we went over in the last video, chapter 8, and in plasmodesmata between plant cells. So not as much is known about plant cell communication because obviously their structures are a lot larger than just a few cells, and and they don't have hormones and an endocrine system like animals do. So a lot of what they do is transmit molecules through the air or else through pathways in their through transport pathways in their stems that we don't know much about at this point. There's also cell recognition, which is when proteins or other molecules on the surface of cells jutting out can react with each other, and as you see here, they seem to fit together, and so that's like a specific protein fitting with a specific substrate. So also, cells may communicate locally, where they're not right next to each other, but through secretion. So paracrine signaling is like a peregrine falcon being released to go find a mouse. That's just a little mnemonic device, paracrine, like peregrine falcon. So these secreting cells will secrete molecules that will then diffuse from the cell, and whenever they hit a target cell with a receptor on the surface that fits with that molecule, then that will have an induced effect. Synaptic signaling is primarily in neurons, so this is called the neural synapse if we're looking at two neuron cells. So this is where one neuron, a motor neuron, which is efferent, which means that it's sending signals out, will send some sort of molecule, the effect of something, across the synapse, and it'll affect a target cell which is stimulated and then has another action potential or response. In muscle contraction, this molecule would be acetylcholine. So this is synaptic signaling because it occurs at the synapse. Long distance signaling is in animals or humans through the endocrine system. When specialized endocrine cells within your glands and your lymph nodes and lymphatic system will secrete things, and then those travel through the blood, and when they reach any target cell, then that will be affected and give a reaction. So this I'm sure you've heard of hormones, whether it be adrenaline, otherwise known as epinephrine, or oxytocin, or any other type of hormone that's transported from the endocrine system through the circulatory system. So there are four main steps of cell signaling. The first is reception, when a receptor protein will pick up a signaling molecule on the surface in the phospholipid bilayer. There's other ways of reception that we'll go into in a bit. Then transduction is when a series of relay molecules or other protein complexes will usually use ATP to transfer that signal down a signal transduction pathway and then activate a response. Finally, that activation has to stop sometime, and so that's inactivation. This can be within an entire cell, like programmed cell death, otherwise known as apoptosis, which we'll also go into, or just simply a halt of the response. So first, reception. There's four main receptor molecules that if you look in your chapter textbook, you can read specifically what each of them specifically how each of them reacts with its signaling molecule, but I'll review them quickly. So there's G protein coupled receptors, which are involved at the surface of the cell a lot of times with epinephrine, which is adrenaline, otherwise it affects the fight or flight response in animals. Hormones from the endocrine system and neurotransmitters, so like at the synaptic cell signaling that we saw. Then there's receptor tyrosine kinases. So a kinase is an enzyme that catalyzes the transfer of phosphate groups from ATP So adenosine triphosphate changes to adenosine diphosphate when it goes through hydrolysis. Hydro, water, lyse, break. Hydrolysis is water breaking off one phosphate ion from ATP and making that adenosine diphosphate, di meaning two, and of course tri meaning three, like a tricycle. So receptor tyrosine kinases are simply receptors that when they receive a signaling molecule at their active site, that makes ATP connect to this tyrosine, which is a protein, and then that activates a response. Also, there are ligand-gated ion channels. This is like a door or a portal. So when the signaling molecule attaches to the active site, and of course the signaling molecule is called a ligand. So that's just another word for that, like a substrate. So when it reaches that active site on this gate, shall we say, that will open, and usually this is involved in ion channels because a lot of ions will pass through, creating a concentration gradient, and then these on the way out will be used to create ATP, and the energy of that will be harnessed by the cell. So intra means within, inter is between, like international is between nations. So intracellular receptor proteins occur within one cell. So this is when a hormone or other receptor or other signaling molecule can go through the phospholipid bilayer because it is hydrophobic, so it can go through that lipid bilayer, and then it has a receptor protein within the cytoplasm of the cell. This often then reacts with that receptor protein, creating a hormone receptor complex. And then that can enter into the nucleus of the cell and create RNA subscription. This is just one example of a pathway from a signaling molecule, but there are other things that they can do. So a signal transduction pathway, we could go into this with a lot more complexity, but I will leave it as simply it's a phosphorylation cascade. So phosphorylation is the addition of a phosphate group, generally from ATP, to a protein or other organic molecule, which turns many protein enzymes on and off. So the signal transduction pathway is merely a lot of different molecules being involved and carrying a signal from the original site of reception to then carry out a response. So all of this is simply the signal transduction pathway, which is, you could go into in more detail in things like photosynthesis, you might want to. However, for this, it's just important to know what that is. So finally, we have second messengers. CAMP, which is cyclic AMP, and if you break that down even more, it's cyclic adenosine monophosphate, which is simply describing the chemical structure, right? So we have one phosphate and we have an adenosine molecule. It is an intracellular messenger, so it goes within the cytosol. Then we have calcium ions, so the response can vary depending on what system you're looking at and depending on what molecules. It's really anything your body or any organism will do because of these chemical reactions. So nuclear response, it can occur on a nuclear level, and it can also occur on an organismal level. So a nuclear response might be genes turning on or off by activation of proteins called transcription factors. So those are within the nucleus of a cell and will activate or inactivate, causing the transcription of RNA, which is then a messenger, and that's translated into a protein. And that will go into in protein transcription and translation later. Also, you can see responses on an organismal level. So if you're looking at the fight or flight response, so imagine that you encountered a lion, you could either fight it or you could run away. Those would be the natural responses, and that's activated by the hormone adrenaline, or otherwise known as epinephrine. And so that will stimulate the fight or flight response in organisms for them to preserve their life. Finally, inactivation can occur both in inactivation of simple nuclear responses, or it can be in apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So this is a clean way of dying for cells. Often what you'll see is phagocytosis is when one cell will essentially eat or break down another cell. So that's used both within the immune system and also for apoptosis, where cells called phagocytes cyte, C-Y-T-E, meaning cell, phag meaning consume, or PHAG. So phagocytes will consume cells that have sent out signals that occur because of other complex signals that say that they must then disintegrate and be consumed. So that's what apoptosis is simply programmed cell death in a very clean way. Thank you for watching. This is Chapter 11, Cell Communication.